Welcome to Open School of Business. We're continuing the topic of handling your finances and having a strategy for your entrepreneurial journey. And today we're going to be discussing a very exciting topic, which is exiting and actually building your business with an exit in mind. And I am very happy to have our guest today, Marvin Storm, who is the founder and the managing director at Business Exit Advisors. His whole business is built around the idea that as an entrepreneur, you have to have an exit in mind when you're building your business. And he has exited many businesses successfully, and today he's going to share his stories with us. Welcome, Marvin. And can I start you off with a question of what has inspired you to come back to the business world after being retired and successfully sold your businesses?
Well, certainly that wasn't the plan. I appreciate you asking the question and having me on your podcast here because I get very passionate when talking about this whole concept of, thinking about your exit before the actual time arrives. Early in my career, was involved in a roundtable discussion with a number of other entrepreneurs from around the country, and the topic of selling the business came up because there were entrepreneurs at different stages of their business development. Some were in the early stage of developing their companies and working hard to scale it, and some were sort of at the tail end of that career. And one of the topics that came up is that this whole concept of exiting. And I remember very well someone vocally saying that you don't want to worry about the exit and when you're going to sell your business, because if you're running a good business, the exit will take care of itself. And I've always remembered that exchange because it was accompanied by these different people and entrepreneurs that were sort of at different stages of their company's growth. And it was for maybe 10, 15 minutes, it was a hotly discussed topic of what should you plan for an exit in advance, or should you let the exit sort of take care of itself by just building a great company. And I think there are arguments on both sides of that. But over the decades that I've been involved in building and scaling businesses, I've come to the conclusion that more often than not, that those that carefully plan for and anticipate an exit generally do better on their exit when the time arrives. They're just, better enabled to be in the right position to exit their business successfully. And I've always remembered that. While it's true, and I know personal examples of people that have done phenomenally well and have never given an exit really a lot of thought. They didn't plan for it, they didn't think about it, and they hit a home run when it came time to exit. But I've concluded over the years that that is by far the exception rather than the rule. So, answering your question, what kind of, I did exit a company fairly successfully. And it was a different type of exit. I'd had a couple of other exits earlier in my career that were much smaller scale. Uh, you know, they were, small number of employees wasn't that great. One of them was more of a consulting type of company. But this last exit had, 100 employees, several hundred locations around the country. I'd worked on that for a number of years to scale it and grow it. And I had private equity involved in it, and it had bankers and boards of directors and transaction attorneys. And it was an experience that I wasn't really well prepared for. And as I walked away and stepped away from the company, I got to thinking after a while, You know, the old adage is that, you know, now that you've sold and exited your company, you can enjoy life. And that's really what I plan to do. I pulled up stakes from the San Francisco Bay Area and moved up into Northern California and what's called the Sierra Foothills. And I, um, you know, thought I would just kind of cruise along and, you know, kick back and enjoy life. And didn't take very long before I was bored stiff. And so I got to thinking about that last exit. And I decided, well, I think I'm going to share some of my experience and the decades of business, um, you know, hard work that I'd put in, and decided to do a podcast. And that's kind of what got me back into this whole thought process of exiting a business. I have developed a podcast called Business Exit Stories. I interview transaction professionals. This means M&A advisors, transaction attorneys, CPA, wealth managers, business brokers, people that, you know, help entrepreneurs exit their business every day. And they bring to the podcast some stories that went well that they've been involved in and some of the takeaways of why. And then some real heart-wrenching, sad stories of exit that didn't go well. They went sideways, they blew up. And in some cases, they didn't get sold and the companies had to close down. And so there's a lot of takeaways in those stories. So that's kind of what got me back involved and, you know, back in the entrepreneurial mindset, if you say. I just really thoroughly enjoyed this whole process of helping entrepreneurs think about how they're going to monetize years, if not decades, of hard work.
Yes, and I think that's very lucky for the clients that you have, and also for the general entrepreneurship community, because you know people like you who've done it before and who want to share their experience. That's very important mechanism, a very important component of the whole infrastructure, entrepreneurial infrastructure, I would say. And, you know, there's people who are not necessarily planning for an exit. They still need to make sure that they can build a business that is separate from their own personal branding and from them as a professional. Because a lot of entrepreneurs, especially like our audience, a lot of people are professionals in their own fields that are thinking about opening their own practice, whether it would be in legal advice or any kind of advice that they're already doing and consulting work that they're already doing. But instead of working for a corporation, they want to open their own advice and advisory firms or practices. But then again, when they do that, if they don't think about the whole system of how the business should work, it becomes like they are hired professionals rather than business owners. So it's
I
very
think,
important to have
mhm.
those systems in place in advance so that you can go on vacation, you can have a balanced life, and not just sell your own services as a professional, but actually build a business where it's going without you. You can be away, you can be managing, and also you can rely on other managers to manage the business where you're just stepping back and thinking about the strategy. So that's why, you know, one of my favorite books is Built to Sell by John Warrillow. And that's what got me thinking that this is the best way to think about your business, is to think, how can I make sure that the value will be still delivered to my customers while I'm away? And that's the businesses that do well when they sell, because the buyers are motivated to buy such business. That's almost like it's going by itself. It's automatic. So I'm really happy to have a conversation with you today, because we can learn more about the things that you tell your clients what to do in advance, how to prepare, um, and generally the best practices that you would advise.
Mhm. Well, the best practices, I think you hit the nail on the head there when you started talking about building a company versus a personal brand. I think there are places for a personal brand, and I think that's crucial and important if you're in that type of business. But the real value, the enterprise value that is built, when you create a company, is really built on those systems that you talked about and having you not being required to be there on a day-to-day basis. If you're required to be in your business for the business to work on a day-to-day basis, then you are the business, or you're much more the business than you should be, because someone that's going to acquire your business sometime in the future is going to need you there. And that's not really where the value in a business is created, by having you there all the time. And that's a critical mistake that a lot of entrepreneurs make. And there's a huge, jump between being an entrepreneur that is the sole driver behind the business and creating, as you referenced in your thoughts there and comments that you shared, of having a management infrastructure in place that can operate while you're not there. That's when real enterprise value is created. And that's when the exit can have an exponential multiplying effect when you get ready to exit the business.
Yeah. So, in your last exit, can you share more about the company and the product or services, the business model, so to
Yeah,
speak?
it was in the logistics business. We moved things around the country. We had both, warehouses and locations around the country. It was a business that required a lot of organization and some technology involved. I got my dose of building custom technology, which I'm not a technologist, I'm not a coder, and so I had to bring in and hire people to do that, and learned over a period of time and able to scale the business. I couldn't do it all on my own. Several of the earlier companies I had been involved in, I was kind of like that person that made things happen. I was the person that did most of the hiring, most of the firing, uh, was the driver behind the business. And this last exit, I had to, evolve my management strategy and skills to step away from that hands-on, everyday, type of management style. And it took some doing to be able to make that jump. But as entrepreneurs generally do, and that's what makes entrepreneurs unique, is that they learn on the job, they figure things out, and they make things work. And that's kind of what I did in the last business I was involved in. I made a jump from, a small to mid-sized entrepreneur to certainly not a Fortune 500 level company, but one that had significant scale.
Right. And what is your management philosophy? Like, how did you make sure that the managers you put in place would follow the vision that you have?
It's all in hiring. That's an old adage. There's an adage, take your time in hiring, hire slow but fire fast, and that's something that I learned by making mistakes. I hired people that uh, had a great resume, had a lot of experience, especially early in my career when I was in my late 20s and early 30s and was growing a company and had dozens of people working for me. I was young, and a lot of the people I was hiring they were a lot older than I was, and I was somewhat intimidated. Kind of had the imposter syndrome. I let the resume sometimes guide my decision making of who they'd worked for, what experience they'd had. I was trying to bring in that experience that I didn't have, and I quickly figured out that you had to hire for talent and versus experience sometimes, especially in the type of businesses I was involved in. It was more talent driven than it was experience driven. I hired experience when it came to technical things like in developing software and things of that nature. But that's my management philosophy: is that you hire talent and character and integrity, and smart people will be able to figure out the job.
Yeah, I
That's been
think
far more successful than the the converse of trying to hire experience all the time.
yes, and it also comes with experience, like you said. That's why it's important to share these stories with younger entrepreneurs because a
Hmm.
lot of people these days they do want to hire the experience that they didn't have
Hmm.
or the knowledge that they don't have to compensate
Hmm.
and to have that balance. So like if the entrepreneur is actually the one who knows best in all the fields, that means he's not really building the right company. He needs to get people who know so much more than herself himself. So it's very tricky in the beginning, the hiring process. And I'm
Yeah,
glad you brought it up
you,
that I think this is one of the key things that entrepreneurs should learn when building their company, and especially if they want to sell it later, because it has to operate without you there. And on the other side, though, like if you were the buyer of companies, what would be your KPIs? What are the companies you would be looking to buy?
well, I think you mentioned an interesting comment there. If I were a buyer, what would I be looking to buy? And that's, I think, a key uh, thought process that most entrepreneurs don't go through. They don't really think about what the buyer is going to be looking for when they are sitting across the table from you discussing acquiring your company. You have to kind of put yourself in the chair of the buyer and ask yourself, if I'm selling my company, what is a buyer going to be interested in when they buy the company? And you've mentioned several times already is that they don't necessarily, they're buying the company. You aren't going to stay with the company forever. You may be there during a transitionary period of time, maybe 6 months, a year and a half, or whatever that may be, to help the new owners, transition into the company and get familiar with your customers and your processes and things of that nature. You may have an employment agreement or a consulting agreement, but eventually you're going not to be there. And so that's one of the key things that you've mentioned several times that is absolutely critical, that you are not the company. You shouldn't be the company anyway. And that you have to have people in place, processes in place, that your company will be able to operate without you, because that's what a buyer is going to be looking for. And so some of the KPIs, the key performance metrics that you know you are looking at, it depends on your industry. Certainly, I had key indicators in my business that I measured my performance, my team's performance, our financial performance on what our gross margins were, what our operating expenses were, what, especially because we were somewhat people intensive, so our salaries were, fairly significant. And so you had to keep those in line with, the rest of your peers in your industry. And you had to be able to pass the baton. We had at one point in time, some, revenue concentration. And I figured out very quickly that that wasn't a good thing. That's something I came to figure on my own because it was scary as an operator of a business to have several of your key customers, if they walked away, it had a major dent in our financial performance and survivability as a company if those key customers sort of walked away and that revenue source disappeared. And I thought about that, as we went through trying to fix that problem. You know, I bet a buyer, if, because I was starting to think about selling, is going to have the same concern. And sure enough, when they go through the diligence process, the due diligence process, that's one of those key checkoff points that they want to know. They don't want 30-40% of a revenue coming from one or two key customers. And at one point in that company's growth, we had a handful of customers that had a significant component of our revenue, and we fixed that over time. But that's something a buyer is going to be concerned, as well as suppliers. People you buy from. You can't have concentration of buyers. And in my podcast, that's come up several times where companies almost became unsaleable because of concentration of customers, concentration of revenue, concentration of suppliers, concentration of key people. One person, other than the entrepreneur, was absolutely critical to the business. They had no employment agreement, no equity tie into the business. If they walked away, the value of the company would just plummet. And unfortunately, some of those people did walk away in some of the stories that are told on my podcast. So it does happen.
Right. And it is true. The HR policies come up again. Like, even though a lot of entrepreneurs, they don't want to be formal, they don't want to enforce certain corporate feel, there are things that there's just bare minimum systems that you have to put in place. And one of them is HR and motivation. And like you said, equity is very important. If you have key employees, you don't want them to be leaving, or at least in the 1 or 2 year horizon. There's got to be something tied to their package, so to speak, so that they will stay and you can successfully transition the company during that time. So that's very very relevant.
I just share just a very quick story here on one of the stories on the podcast. This entrepreneur, entrepreneurs tend to be bullheaded. They tend to, create a lot of self-importance. That's why they're successful entrepreneurs, because they have all this self-confidence and they have this can-do attitude, and that they can make things happen and get things done. And they don't necessarily value the people around them a lot of times that kind of make those things happen. And this particular story is about an entrepreneur that had that mindset, and he had a key employee that didn't have an employment agreement, and thought he did, but he just didn't have what he thought he had in the file. So when the due diligence process came about, they asked for the employment agreement, and it wasn't there, and he thought it was there, really. And it came time, they had to go get an employment agreement signed by that key employee, because the buyer would not acquire the business with that key employee, because he was crucial to the operation of that business, because he had so much product knowledge. Well, when they showed up to have that employment agreement signed, he was smarter than you gave him credit for. And his attorney, the entrepreneur's attorney, said, just give him a signing bonus, and the entrepreneur went ballistic. He said, I paid this guy well. He gets great bonuses and benefits. He has a company car. I'm not going to give him a bonus just for signing this deal, because the bonus was like $100,000 just to execute that employment agreement. He refused to give it to him. And so the employee refused to sign it, and the buyer is going to walk away from the table. And so the entrepreneur, realizing there were millions of dollars on the line, begrudgingly said, okay, I'll pay you the bonus. That bonus went from $100,000 to $500,000 to get him to sign that contract. And so, licking his wounds, the entrepreneur knew that he had to pay that bonus and get it signed. So
that's funny. In Kazakhstan, we say the greedy pays twice.
It's just a fun story that you hear of arrogance and not taking care of the people that make you successful sometimes. So it was a good story.
Yeah, and the great thing about this, these are all real stories, and this is all real stuff that's happening in the industry. And that's why I love having you today. And in sharing with us, there are certain KPIs, right, that the buyers look at, and the number of customers, the revenue amount, the the expenses. Like there's certain KPIs, certain things that they put in place to evaluate the company.
Mm-hmm.
And in your opinion, or what you've seen so far, what are the key ones, or like the ones that are absolutely crucial that affect other things and therefore they're so critical, or the things
Well,
that no M&A would ever deal with if those things are not in place?
what I hear time and time again, and I experienced in my career, is key performance metrics are absolutely crucial. And it really, I'm going to kind of punt the ball here, saying it really depends on your industry what those key performance metrics are. But here's the deal: is that they have whatever those key performance metrics are, they have to be verifiable, they have to be trusted, they have to have ample data and verifiability behind them, or they don't mean anything. And so often, entrepreneurs are these deal makers. They're the people that get out and make things happen. They leave it to their bookkeeper, sometimes an outside CPA, to keep track of their financials, and they don't think about what a buyer is going to want to see and need. And so when the time comes for the rubber to meet the road and they have to produce verifiable, you know, financial data and metrics, uh, what they provide is sketchy at best. And if you are sitting on the other side of the table and you're looking at, financial metrics that are somewhat difficult to verify and they aren't complete, they may not go back as many years as showing a history, historical patterns and data that can be verified, then that really hits your valuation hard. When you can't absolutely lock down, bulletproof metrics, financial statements, you're going to take a hit because that just increases the risk for the buyer. And so I often tell people, if you were on the other side of the table looking at the information that you are planning on providing a buyer, would you buy your company? Would you lay out millions of dollars to purchase your company based on the information you're going to be giving them? Because so often the entrepreneurs, they know their business so well, they know how it works, they know what information is important and what isn't important and what is meaningful and what they have to keep track of, but they never quantify this. They never put it in the right context and so that it's verifiable for someone that isn't familiar with their company. And they just don't kind of make that leap. And then when I often sit there and across the table talking to some of these very bright and capable entrepreneurs that are getting close to positioning their company for a sale, and you ask them the blunt question, would you buy your company based on these financials? Would you write the check for your company based on these? And sometimes you get very sheepish looks saying, oh, you're right. I don't know if I would, you know. But they're so
Yeah.
confident because they've run this company for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and they know it cold. And they have a high degree of confidence in the ability of that company and the team that they've put together to execute. But you have to translate that to someone that isn't familiar with that, doesn't have the decades of experience, and they want to see hard, verifiable numbers and metrics. And it can be gross margins, it can be sales growth. Depends on who your buyer is. If you're looking at a strategic buyer, they're more interested in market share and the growth rate and who your customers are, and how the customers may or may not overlap into their market if they're a strategic buyer, or a financial buyer that's more dialed in to really what the gross margins are, the profitability, what the earnings are after taxes, the company EBITDA that you hear so often, earnings before taxes, amortization and interest. Those are the type of things a financial buyer will be interested in. But it has to be verifiable, is my point. You need to have that locked down and bulletproof.
Yeah, right. And I like how you categorize the buyers into two groups, the strategic and the financial. And I think you can address each one separately. For example, when we're talking about the financial one, they're going to be looking not only at your financials, but also at your motivation and the period of when you're selling, because they want to know why this person is leaving. Why not just run the company for another couple of years? If everything, that's great. Like how do entrepreneurs usually position their sale when they know the buyer is a financial one? Because I think it's more difficult, because then how you going to answer that question? Why not just take more money year after year? It's smooth now, it's operational. Like, what's the answer to that?
Well, I think you hit a key point here. I think that a financial buyer is generally private equity or someone that has a specific plan in mind that they're going to try to monetize your business. They're making an investment in the ability of the company to continue to grow. So they're going to be much more dialed into your management infrastructure. Who's the team that's going to carry on? What's their capabilities and talent level? How are they going to be able to execute? Who they may be looking at, how can they can streamline the company. If it's a roll up where they're acquiring several companies in their space, they may be looking at cutting expenses and eliminating some back office type of overhead. Uh, and they will want to know how they're going to be able to increase the financial performance of that company over a period of 3, 5, 7 years to be able to capitalize on their investment and get a good return on their investment. Well, a strategic buyer can be entirely different. They may not be so interested in who the management is necessarily, because that management may be replaced, because they're just interested in your customers, because your customers are similar, your customers overlap. They may be similar customers that don't have their specific product, and they can market to your customer base, or conversely have your product to sell to their customer base. And so
Yeah.
you really have to, early in the process, when you're meeting with your M&A advisor, your business broker, who's ever advising you, of really who the buyers, who are you going to go after, and then try to position your company to appeal to that type of buyer. Um,
Hmm. Yeah, I love that example. And we can see that, for example, Coca-Cola buying up Honesty Company, which is a
mhm,
great company, but they were not making any profit.
mhm.
And I don't, with the scale that Coca-Cola has, probably now they're making a profit, which I haven't followed up on, I haven't researched. But same with Amazon buying Whole Foods, it's just a lot of synergy. And a lot of times, these companies don't care that much about how much money you're making. It's all about the customer and also just the
Right.
product itself, if it's something complementary to what they're doing already.
Yeah, well, you
So,
mentioned Amazon, and that's a great story. I don't know if you watch Shark Tank, but the entrepreneur that showed up on Shark Tank with his company Ring, and he didn't get an investment, and he walked away without an investment. And less than 3 years later, he sold his company to Amazon for $1 billion because of that synergy. Because his Ring doorbells that
yeah.
showed a picture of who's ringing the doorbell was strategic for Amazon. That fit into Amazon's value proposition of what they were delivering, because they deliver packages to doors every day, millions of times a
Yeah.
day. And so they were willing to pay up for that. They were willing to buy uh, that company for far more than it was worth, because it was still not making any money or anything. But it
Mm-hmm.
had a value proposition that fit into what they wanted. They didn't want to build it; they wanted to
Right.
buy it,
Yeah, the
and
tech
they
is
paid
great.
up.
We use it at home, and I
Mhm.
love that. And exactly, I was thinking exactly what we see is the Amazon packages piling up, and we know it's safe. So it's
Mhm.
just a great synergy. I love that story.
But that's a great story of
Yeah.
type of buyer. That was a strategic acquisition. Strategic acquisitions tend to be far more lucrative for the entrepreneur
Mhm.
than a financial buyer in
Well,
general.
in that example, it was lucky or maybe even strategic of the owner to go on Shark Tank and become sort of famous and walk away
Mm,
because he became visible to Amazon. Are there
yeah,
any
yeah.
other ideas of how to become visible to certain companies that you're thinking that, oh, they would actually be interested in something I'm doing?
That's where an advisor can really help you out because entrepreneurs, they don't do this every day.
Yeah.
They don't exit their company every day. And as a general rule, myself included, um, yeah, I'd had a few smaller exits, so I thought I know more than I did. But once you, whether you're going through it for the first time or the second or third time, you never know everything that you should know. An advisor that does this every day, all day long, deals in 10, 20, 30 deals a year, they know the process. They know what type of buyers are out there. If you get the right advisor, they know the strategic players in the field. I have a lot of entrepreneurial friends that run companies that they just cannot swallow the fact that they're going to have to pay all these big fees to an advisor or an attorney, and it's going to
Yeah,
cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's just a hard pill to swallow sometimes. But quite frankly, in my
it's worth
opinion,
it.
it's the best money you'll ever spend if you get the right advisor because they will pay for themselves 5, 10 times if you get the right one because they can bring the right type of buyer to the table and tell your story uh,
Yeah.
and position your company properly.
Right. And I'm assuming at your company, you have this business exit advisors. You have like a portfolio of advisors that you can choose from,
Yeah, we
or
have
you
over the
help
over the time I've been
entrepreneurs
yeah
to connect
oh,
with them.
yeah over the time I've been out kind of my last hurrah here in my career, at the sort of the tail end of my career, I've developed all these great relationships out there of advisors, almost in every specific vertical out there. I've interviewed hundreds of them, and they've shared, all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories and stories of financial exits, financial buyers, strategic, um, you know, things that didn't go well, and so it's really critical that you find the right advisor. And for those that listen to the podcast, they often say, "Well, I'm getting to the point now. I need to be. I need someone that can take the time to understand my company and tell me a little bit of what I need to do to position it, and help me find the right buyer." Once they start dialing into this whole process that they need, it's all about positioning and timing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, then they start thinking about who can help me uh, that last lap. Who's going to get me across the finish line with the biggest paycheck?
Yeah. And it's fair to say that in real estate, for example, if you want your house sold, you hire a real estate agent and you pay the percentages. But if they don't sell, you don't pay. How does it work with the business exit advisors? Do you pay anything upfront or do you negotiate a certain amount from the
Well,
deal?
generally, most M&A advisors and investment bankers, business brokers, are all success fee oriented. They don't. There are some that take a retainer, especially on the buyer side if they're representing buyers. But generally speaking, you don't pay money up front. The best ones will vet you. They're not going to represent you unless they believe that they can sell your company because their time is money.
Right.
They don't want to waste time with companies that are going to be difficult to sell, and they're not going to, make a lot of money in selling the company because it's going to be such a huge investment of time. They want companies that are, you know, have the right type of entrepreneur at the head of the top of the company, running the company properly, have their financials in place, and so the best advisors out there are the ones that they don't take every deal, every business that comes along that approaches them to get sold. They want to be able to, they know who their clients are. Most advisors out there have a portfolio or, a list of people that are buying companies, and they know what type of companies they're looking for.
All right. It's a great because you answered a question that I had in my mind. How do you identify a good advisor? And how do you choose one? So I guess the first one would be they should have their own criteria. And once you know that you qualify for their criteria, then you can have an interview and maybe ask them a few questions. So if an entrepreneur wanted to like interview the advisors and find out who would be a better fit, what kind of questions do you think they should ask?
Well, that's great. And that the key to your whole question there is you don't do it at the last minute. You
Right.
don't
Yeah.
try to find an advisor, when you have to sell your company. You want to, start, talking to people quite a while before it comes time to exit and find out, who's out there, find out where there's a good fit personality wise, what different firms out there, different advisors do, what their criteria are, and then start planning, start working with them to position your company. And so, if you've already got your company teed up for an exit, you've already been planning for it like you should. You mentioned John Warlow and others out there that help company people think about the process of getting their companies ready for an exit. If you've gone through that process and you've gone through and checked off the key deal points that a buyer is going to be looking at, you're just much further down the road. And so when you do eventually find an advisor that's going to help you through, they handle the technical part. They will handle the negotiation, the positioning of your company, the packaging of your company, getting it ready for the type of buyer that they think will be the most likely to acquire your company.
Great. And it's great that there are services out there like yours that connect entrepreneurs to the advisors. And it's a great idea. And you've been doing it for how many years now
I've been
that
doing
you've
this
been back?
coming up 3 years now. It's
Three
just
years.
been a delightful ride. I had decades of experience getting to the point after stepping away from my last company, and then to just have the opportunity then to use all of this prior experience and the contacts that I have within now the M&A community and different attorneys out there, wealth managers that I've been introduced to. It's just delightful to be able to make introductions and help entrepreneurs through a process that they may never have been through it, they may never go through it again. Uh, they're running their business, so they get somewhat in a routine where they're doing things, you know, every year they do certain things to grow their company. But when it comes to exiting in a company, you may only get one or two shots your entire career to stand at the plate and to swing at the ball. And you
Mm.
better be on top of your game. You don't want to strike out. That's the last thing you want.
Yeah. And it's amazing how you said that your whole career sort of led up to it. So even though it's 3 years, you've built the network, the knowledge about it, and everything that would make you successful in your new
Yeah, so,
business.
some of the
And
best learnings I've
yeah.
had came decades ago. That you have to experience some things to really comprehend and understand the lesson to be learned. And some of those things are failures. And I've had my share in my career. And those smart, and you learn. And to be able to share that type of information with someone that's kind of teeing their company up for an exit and to share personal experiences from that happened to you decades ago. It's just very rewarding. Some of the best times I've had and most rewarding times I've had in my entire career is to help other people monetize decades of hard work in their company.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's very fulfilling. And then it's like giving back to the entrepreneurial community. even though your company is for profit, still is a lot of wisdom and a lot of giving back. Um, and I wonder, you know, if you want to talk about some of your first clients and how did those deals go, and what you learned from them. Like, can you sort of identify your target audience now more specifically after 3 years that you've been
Well,
doing it?
they kind of fall into three buckets. Um, you have the, and it's not always the monetary value of that the company, meaning the gross sales that a company has, but that's a good indicator of the number of employees they have, their profitability, and the type of buyers that are going to be interested in those type of companies. So you have what are called Main Street type of businesses. These are, John and Mary Smith, or a family starts a business. They have several $1 million of sales, and they make a good living. They may make a very good living, but they are generally the engine behind the company. They haven't built a great infrastructure. And whoever is going to step into that company is probably going to fill a similar role in their company, meaning that they're going to step in and be there on a day-to-day basis. And so the metrics that that type of company will be able to sell for, the valuation of that company is really tied to, the earnings of the company, and what can be financed through a bank, and what that EBITDA, or the net, the earning, the tax return earnings on that company are really going to justify to be able to finance, because the owner that buys that company is probably going to fill a similar role that the company owner is that's selling the company. So that's kind of bucket number one. Then you have what would be called lower middle market companies that are, 2 to 3 million up to $5 to $10 million in sales. And at that point in time, the entrepreneur is not absolutely critical to the company. They generally have a general manager. They may have several vice presidents, other, managers in the company. Uh, they may be involved in the company, but they are generally not the engine behind the company. They generally have lines of credit with banks. They have outside accountants and attorneys. They're running the company. Um, they're taking money out of the company. Where in my first bucket, most of the earnings go to the entrepreneur. Most of the earnings. We're in bucket number two, this lower mid-market company. Uh, the owner is taking a salary. They have benefits. They have retirement plans, medical, and things of that nature. But the company itself is making good money, and that's what's going to sell, is the company itself. And when the entrepreneur sells, they're going to put in another CEO or president of the company that's going to be running, and they're going to pay that person a salary that is generally going to be what the entrepreneur would have been taken out of the company. Then you get into, the kind of the third bucket that's above that $10 to $15 million in range. And then you really find that strategic buyers are more interested in those type of companies. Private equity is generally interested in those type of companies, and they're looking at a different set of criteria, more professionally managed companies than the first two buckets. So when you talk about the type of deals that I work in, I've worked with people in all three of the buckets. And quite frankly, some of the more interesting and meaningful work takes place in bucket number one, where it's generally in that bucket where not a lot of thought has been given to an exit, generally very little. And that's where the most impact can be made, and where the most value can be derived from some good, thoughtful, strategic thinking about how you're going to get out of the company. It always amazes me that people will spend hundreds of hours figuring out how to get into a company, and months and a year figuring out which business to get in and how to start it and do all this stuff. And then they run this company for a decade or two or most of their life, but they don't give 10 hours of thinking about how they're going to get out of it. It's just,
Yeah.
it's just
It's just
It's just not a part of their
entrepreneurial
thought
mind
process. Yeah,
in a way,
yeah,
because we're so
that's true.
occupied
That's true.
with what we want to deliver to the customer, what should be the next exciting project. And it just goes on and on. And like you said, in the evaluation, I feel like the owners always evaluate a little bit more because of all the hard work that they put in it and all the brilliant ideas they had. Those are all the intangible things that when they evaluate, they think, oh, this is more than the papers say. This is something I devoted so many years. And therefore, I can understand that a lot of times owners might feel like, you know, it definitely it is like I value it so much more, and the way they see it, if you prepare in advance, then you would know what is the figure you're ready to walk away and move on to the next chapter of your life. Otherwise, I don't think it will never be enough. Like any kind of offer might feel like it's too small if you're not planning in advance,
That's
because
true.
you're going to be looking retrospectively in your history and thinking, oh, so many years I did this, I did that, and sacrificed some parts of my life. So that's why I always like to advise people to think about the ultimate figure that they want to get out of their business when it's super successful. Because if you don't have the figure, you're going to be working endlessly
Yeah,
for,
the problem
yeah,
is that figure
and
may
chasing
have
it.
no basis in reality. You know,
Uh,
because I've
It's
worked hard and I've worked for 20 years, and my business is worth $2 million or 5 million or whatever the number is. That's what I think
yeah,
it's worth.
it's
And
bound
then
by their imagination. So
yeah,
that's why it's
but
good to
there's
have that professional advisor who would keep you, get you in touch with the reality, I should say, because then you'd know, like, okay, in this field, mid-sized companies or this many people, employees, and this many customers and the revenue, they usually get evaluation of some amount. So then like around some kind of figures, like when you're selling a house, buying a house, already what's the market prices. But when it's the company, a lot of people don't know. So even when they know how much they're making, what amount of uh, demand and supply in the industry happens, they still might not know the range that companies go for. And I think it's important, even if you're not planning to sell, just to know the value. So I encourage everyone to have an advisor and find some kind of feedback to evaluate your company, even if you're not planning to sell right now. I think that's a very good idea.
oh, I would support that thesis. I guess is that you're in a much better position if you know what you have and what it's worth, instead of speculating what you think someone might think it's worth. And there are
Mhm.
some, just like you said, you gave the example of selling your house. There are standards out there that different types of companies are valued with, and the only
Mhm.
thing in selling a company is that if you do the things right and you can position it to be of value to a strategic buyer, it is different than real estate in that sense, is that real estate generally sells for comps of what other real estate sold around, and that's generally true in this bucket number one that I talked about. But in the other two buckets, you have a much larger opportunity to get something far outsized because it has strategic value to somebody. It is worth more than it is worth to you. It is worth more to somebody else, maybe two, three, four times more worth it to somebody else because of who you are, where you're located, what you're selling, has value to somebody else.
Yes, and that's a great reminder, because that somebody else is also the amount of money they're willing to give to acquire that resource can be something unimaginable in scale to the owner of the company. So it's good to have the advisor for sure, because you wouldn't know. Like the example of the ring, it's just the classic example of how much really companies can go for. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs aspire to exactly that. So I think one last question before we can close this amazing interview is I'm curious about your business model. I see that you connect people, you advise them as well. But how does it all come together in a profitable way?
Well, I started out, quite frankly, I didn't really envision this turning into what it has turned into. And maybe that's a little self confession here, is that I was at a point in my career which I had a successful exit. I just got bored and doing what it's. I started this podcast just because it was enjoyable, and that has sort of blown up. I guess it's just sort of gotten lift under its wings, and this has opened the door to not only advisors that I've met, these spectacularly successful M&A people, wealth managers, business brokers that I talk to. They have 5, 10, 20 years of experience and thousands of deals that they've done over their careers. And that has generated an audience of entrepreneurs that listen to these stories, at businessexitstories.com. They listen to these stories, and the takeaways of, I've had feedback come from people who says, well, I don't want to end up like that guy. It sounds just like my company. I don't want to end up like him because I was headed down the same road. I was having the same issues that he was having. And boy, that was such a good episode.
Yeah.
Who can I talk to that can help me not make those same mistakes? And so that really kind of mushroomed into kind of the consulting side of the business, where BX advisors and being able to hook the entrepreneurs up. And then I'm writing a book called Pack Your Parachute. It's based on the metaphor is that you don't have too many pilots that try to pack their parachutes when their engines are on fire. And that's what a lot of business owners do a lot of times, is that they try to get their business ready to sell and try to sell it when the engines are on fire. And it doesn't work out very well. But if they have that parachute packed, if something happens unexpectedly in their business, such as an illness, a death, problems with a partner, they get burned out, competition, if they have their business and have gone through the process of thinking about positioning their business, they're much more likely to be able to exit their business profitably because everything is done. All the financials are in place. All the metrics that they need to have validated and verified are in place. Their management agreements are in place. Employment agreements, all that stuff is taken care of. And they're much more likely to have a successful exit. And then if there isn't an emergency, you're all ready to go. You've done the homework. And so the probability of leveraging that exit to something spectacular is greatly increased. So I'm writing this book that is a culmination of my own experiences, a lot of the case studies, and I've developed this whole process that I'm, working on delivering, at different, levels. Some people need one-to-one, some people just want to do it online, take their time, learn it on their own. So there'll be something for everyone. And that's been really, really exciting for me to kind of work through that process of creating a process for people to follow years in advance from getting their company teed up. And then when they get teed up, to be able to hook up with the right advisors. So that's kind of the business model.
All right, that's amazing. And I wish a lot of luck to your business, to your podcast. And we can't wait for your book to be published. Then you can come back and present the book once it's there. And sure. I think it's going to also attract a lot of customers back to your business. So I'm very excited for that.
Well, one thing I might mention here is that anyone in your audience there, I've prepared this kind of report that kind of encapsulates everything we've talked about here today. If they'd like a copy of that, just go to businessexitstories.com/report, and you'll be given a link just to download the report so you can kind of read through it and give you kind of an idea of what you should be doing well in advance of getting your business ready for sale.
All right, great. I'm excited for it as well. I'm going to go and download that one as well. Thank you
All right.
so much. And I hope you have more successful exit stories. And we certainly enjoyed this exit story
Well, it's been
episode.
delightful. Thank you for having me today. I've really enjoyed the discussion.